Hi, hello, hi. What's up, guys? Welcome back. We're here for another Convergence class breakdown. This one is for the Aberrant Heretic. It's a sorcery class that scales with Int and Arcane, deals physical damage, and applies bleed buildup as its primary status effect. The thing about this class is, it's one of the very few sorcery classes that uses melee primarily in terms of its range. It doesn't have a lot of long-range options. It has a few, but mostly it focuses on staying close. Its playstyle kind of reflects that. It has some extremely powerful buffs, especially for hybrid, people using like a melee weapon along with other spells. Its buffs tend to be extremely effective at things like defense or keeping enemies slightly off of you or disrupted. And in the bleed status effect, it leverages more than even some other classes that use bleed. Its spells sort of have the sort of kiss-curse mechanic of they add bleed buildup on the player when you cast them, but they don't cost you health most of the time. A few of them do cost health, but mostly it's just building up bleed on the player as sort of its negative downside, similar to the way that madness spells work, or like frenzy. Let's get into the spells themselves. So Body of Briar is one of your opening spells, and it's a buff. The way it works is cover your body in bloody thorns, increasing poise and physical absorption by 20%. It also causes roll dodges to deal damage to nearby enemies, lasts for 1 minute. So pretty straightforward. It's just a defensive buff, something that's sort of crucial to this class style because it's forcing you to stay close a lot of the time. Also adding a little touch of damage on your dodge rolls, so that's nice. And here's how it looks. Basically covers your body in these thorns, so you can roll into them. But at this player level, the damage is not too bad. Early game, this damage is pretty terrible. Briar Wrapped Armament, this is just a weapon buff that adds some increased physical damage and some additional bleed. Pretty normal, typical damage buff spell. Briars of Sin, this is the one from vanilla, but we've changed the animation to be a little faster. It still has the 3-part cast where the circle gets bigger each cast you use. However, we have edited it so that you can dodge out of it quicker than before. So it's not nearly as much opportunity cost in that you can dodge out as soon as those circles appear, which is very, very useful. To me, it makes the spell like a lot more viable in a lot more situations. It's actually like pretty decent to use early game if you have your timing down. So it obviously builds up damage, does damage, and builds bleed. Up next, we have a healing spell called Close Wound. So the way this works is you can tap it for sort of a long cast time. But if you hold it, then you'll continue channeling the heal, and each one of those will chunk your life back up really quickly. Very effective spell, very good. Up next, Strangling Briars. So this one is one of your few long-range options, but it doesn't do upfront damage. What it does is a dot, so damage over time, and then each tick of the dot also builds up some bleed on the target. So I hit that guy, it's dotting him, and then after a certain amount of bleed buildup, boom, you'll get a bleed proc. So really, really good spell to open with because of the additional range that it has over most Aberrant spells. And just generally like one of your strongest openers. Pretty much one of your only openers. Up next we have Thorn Burst. So this one's kind of interesting. It uses a shotgun style mechanic where it shoots out a bunch of bullets in all directions. And this one really is all directions. It's not just in front or behind. It's everywhere. That's what it looks like. And it shoots them out in all directions. But it's just like any shotgun. The closer you are, the higher chance that they'll get hit with multiples of these. And if they get hit with multiples, it's much more effective. Technically speaking, you can hit things from far away with this. It's just kind of hard. That it's very likely to miss. But the damage on it is kind of insane because of the randomness, right? We wanted to give it like pretty high damage given the fact that it is pretty random. So there are times where getting up close and spamming this is really good, especially on large bosses. And it has the triple cast mechanic similar to Briars of Sin. So up next we have Briars of Punishment. This is your first sort of like mainstay long range spell. It does allow you to fight things at range. So we're not closing down that option entirely. And just like vanilla, the range on this is decent, but unlike vanilla, the range is further than base game. So you can see here, the damage on this spell is actually quite good, but because enemies can get out of it by running in close to you quickly or dodging to the side quickly, and the travel time of the projectiles on the slower side, also the cast time is on the slower side, we felt that it was relatively balanced to give a mid to long range spell, just because the opportunity cost on casting this is very high, but the damage kind of makes up for it. Definitely hits really hard. For me personally, when I'm doing spell-only playthroughs with this class, this is like my most important spell. I use this throughout most of the playthrough until I get to late game. Really, really good. It also does have a small AoE, so if enemies are real clustered together, you can hit multiples. Up next, Telekinetic Shell, the spell that we've had to rebalance several times. Originally, it knocked back enemies harder than it currently does, and it also used to build bleed, which it does not do anymore. But basically, it puts a shell around you, and when this is active, spells fired at you will get deflected, but enemies will get knocked back by it, and it will do a little bit of damage when it knocks them back. Now, my character is late game, so you can see the damage is actually pretty good, but early game, the damage is negligible. The point of it is that it controls enemies when they're close. And we are aware that this is extremely strong. The spell is really, really, really good because it's basically a permanent keep off me button. And one of the reasons we felt it was okay to give it to this class was because they have such limited long-range options, we wanted to give them something that compensated for that in a very meaningful way. The other thing that sort of balances this spell, I think, is the fact that a lot of bosses don't care. They're not going to be staggered by this. Some will, and when they do, it's extremely good. But it's definitely not universal. It also doesn't have any defensive buffing capability. Like, it doesn't reduce the amount of incoming damage you take, but it will deflect spells. It will not deflect things like arrows or ballista. But you can sort of use it to leverage in certain situations to build up stagger, build up poise break, and also against most trash mobs, quote unquote, especially when you're running through dungeons, it's a good way to get past stuff without having to worry too much about it. Definitely one of the more useful spells in their toolkit. It's been nerfed a few times, and we now think it's in like a decent place. It's still really, really strong, though. Ritual of Desecration. Okay, so you've got actually two buff spells. One is Ritual of Desecration, and the other is Sadistic Glee. Okay, Ritual of Desecration. It's an offensive enchantment. When this spell is cast, it causes bleed buildup on you and deals damage to you, and also drains all of your stamina. So the reason here is that the opportunity cost on this spell is massive. The idea is that you really don't want to use this very often if you are in combat. You want to use it before combat because it's going to hurt you, it's going to cause bleed buildup on you, and also make it hard for you to do anything with stamina bottoming out when you cast it. Now, obviously, that's super temporary because stamina comes back really quickly. But it increases the damage of your Aberrant sorceries by 10%, grants 2 HP and 2 FP recovery per second. That recovery is insane. It's really, really, really strong. Plus the additional damage to spells. Like, this thing, if you precast before a boss, it's really what it's designed for. It definitely gives you a huge edge in most boss fights. But it does only last for 1 minute, and that was a very intentional choice. 1 minute is not very long, right? So it's very likely to wear off before the fight is over, unless you're able to bum rush the boss down. But here's how it looks. You can see it chunks your HP down. It has a slow cast time. And, yeah, it didn't bottom out my stamina, but that was just because I was not in combat. If you're in combat, it'll bottom it out. So another reason why you wouldn't want to use this actually in combat or against, you know, like in the middle of a boss fight. But yeah, see, when that buff is active, it's going to make the damage of all my stuff increase, and my HP will be ticking up. So Sadistic Glee is equivalent. It's similar to Ritual of Desecration, except it is for melee rather than for spells. So when the spell is cast, causes bleed buildup on you, deals damage to you, and drains all of your FP. So it drains all of your mana, right? Way more of a downside. But increases your weapon damage by 5% and causes all successful weapon hits on enemies to recover your HP. So essentially it gives you the Melania effect, and the amount of recovery you get from this is greater than the one we added for Melania's Great Rune, and they stack. So there's certain weapons in this class, like the Eochade's weapon, that does like the spinning corkscrew and hits a bunch of times. So Sadistic Glee combined with that can be sort of, I'm tempted to use the word broken, but it's very strong, very, very good. It's not trivial. It's a very, very strong combination. So because we were aware of how much staying power that this buff would give you, we didn't want to give it a 10% weapon buff. In terms of damage, a 5% was enough because of that recovery mechanic, giving you that rally. Okay, next is Red Glintstone Razor. So this is a lot like Carian Slicer in terms of the animation, but the difference is that it deals physical damage instead of magic, like all their spells. It causes bleed buildup as well, but it costs a lot more stamina and a lot more FP to use. It also does less damage than something like Carrion Slicer because of the bleed buildup on it. So it's basically Aberrant's Slicer. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Up next, we have Crimson Rose. So Crimson Rose is kind of like Briars of Punishment, except it shoots it in all directions, like this. And they have a much tighter range, like in terms of how far they go. The other difference is that the vines on the ground before the sprouts at the end also cause damage, right? This is a spell we've had to tweak quite a bit to get it to work properly, but it does now. It hits everything very reliably in the area. It also does a lot of damage. The DPS on this is quite high, and so is the bleed buildup. So kind of give a demonstration here. Oh, he dodged. The thing about Crimson Rose is that it's not meant to be 100% reliable on everything you hit. This class does have a sort of chaotic randomness to it. However, if something is large, has like a large hitbox, then it is capable of hitting something more than once. So it's definitely one of those spells that's sort of incentivizing you to use it on large bosses or large crowds, right? It's not really meant to do a single target as much. Okay, up next we have Bloodstar, Telekinetic Assault, Red Glintstone Shards, Eochade's Sap, Blood Comet, and Crimson Great Blade. Okay, Bloodstar is a permanent enchantment. It's perpetual. It stays on until you either warp or die. Its effects are pretty nice considering that it never wears off. So it gives you a light source, increases all physical damage you deal by 5%, and grants you 2 HP recovery per second. No downside to this. Kind of no reason not to use it. Almost no matter what build you're using within Aberrant, it's just a really good spell. Definitely nothing wrong with this. As soon as I get it, I have it on pretty much the whole time. Telekinetic Assault is Elimer's attack, or the Bellbearing Hunter's attack, where you throw the staff, and if you keep spamming, you'll keep throwing it. You'll just keep it out there, and then it'll come back. So the range on this is not fantastic. Definitely true. But the damage on it is kind of insane. Like, it does so much damage that if you're actually allowed to stand at this range and spam this thing, there's not too many spells that can compete with it in terms of DPS. It's definitely a great spell for those moments when something might be immune to bleed, just because the DPS output on it is so high. One oddity about the spell is if you cast it from the left hand, it will actually move your staff to your right hand in the middle of it. So your first cast might be L1, but then your follow-ups might need to be R1 in order for it to work properly, and that's just sort of a limitation of that animation. It's kind of a funky spell in that way. Alright, Red Glintstone Shards. So this is a lot like the Frost Witch's Ice Shards, where it shoots out a shotgun effect. So, similar situation, another shotgun, the closer you are, the more damage you're going to get, because they're going to get hit by more of them. It's kind of like the spell that turns you into a pincushion, where you can shoot them out in all directions, except it's directed. You actually can aim it. Range on it's pretty short, but damage potential very high. Okay, Eochade's Sap. This one is one of the more interesting ones because this is one that's designed to attack the target's posture or poise. It's really what it's for. It does extremely high poise damage. It does some bleed buildup, but it's really not designed to do upfront damage, like as much upfront damage by itself. You do 2 smashes. Pretty short range, but you can very quickly and easily stagger stuff, cause poise breaks, especially if you're using it in tandem with something like Telekinetic Shell, because Telekinetic Shell offers continuous hits, therefore preventing the target from resetting their poise. So you could run in with something like Razor and Telekinetic Shell, and then finish before the shell runs out with Sap and generate staggers that way. Works very, very well. Blood Comet. So this just got buffed. This is basically a comet where it shoots out a projectile. On the previous patches, the range on this was kind of pathetic. It was really, really, really bad range. We were, I think, a little bit... we undertuned the range. Whereas now, on the upcoming patch, the range is actually pretty decent. It's a true mid-range spell, and the damage on it is huge. So it kind of replaces your Briars of Punishment slot in terms of dealing, range damage. Okay, and then next is Crimson Greatblade. This is a lot like Adula's Moonblade, in that it does a great sword attack that shoots out wave projectiles. Once again, damage is really high. I think the posture damage on this is also on the higher side. And the shape of the actual sword is Elimer's. It's Elimer's great sword. It's got no tip. It's got no point. This is just a flat-looking blade. Definitely a fun one. All right, next set of spells. So the last two are Aberrant Ascension and Blood Revelry. These are your two permabuffs, legendary enchantments. So here's how these work. So Aberrant Ascension is the caster version. Increases damage of aberrant sorceries by 10%. Increases casting speed by 40%. Grants immunity to bleed, but also lowers your absorption to all damage by 20% and lowers your total stamina by 20%. So to me, like, this is just, are you a spellcaster more than you are a melee player? Because all your spells cause bleed buildup on yourself, and this prevents that totally, but also increases casting speed while also increasing damage. So kind of no downside. I think the biggest downside to this is actually the stamina loss rather than the absorption loss. I think the stamina loss does matter. It causes me to want to level my my endurance more in the late game when I start using Ascension. But it's not much of a downside in my opinion. Not a huge deal. Then Blood Revelry. This is an interesting one. When blood loss occurs in your vicinity, you gain an effect for 10 seconds. This effect increases all physical damage you deal by 10%, grants 25 HP recovery per second, and 5 FP recovery per second, and 5 stamina recovery per second. This effect does not stack. So the idea here is you're causing bleed. You're either A, bleeding opponents near you, or bleeding yourself. And when you do that, you get this proc, and the proc only lasts 10 seconds, but while it's active, it's crazy. All your damage goes up. It's really hard to kill you because your FP or your HP is coming back so quickly, and you don't, like, 5 FP recovery per second is gigantic. It's crazy how fast that FP recovery is. Like, that is so much, especially considering that it stacks with other FP recovery sources. And then also your stamina doesn't go away. This is just one of these things where if bleed is happening and you're able to leverage it, then yeah, you're pretty tough to stop. I mean, you can still be killed, obviously. 25 HP per second is not that much, but it is a lot. You know, if you have any sort of survivability at all, this is just very, very strong. So yeah, that is all the Aberrant spells. Up next, we got Aberrant weapons. So we're just going to focus on two because of the two completely original ones that we've added into the mod here. So this one is the Thorn of the Guilty. So this is a thrusting weapon. It has your kind of normal thrusting moveset, and then your heavies are the double poke. Poke, poke. And then its weapon art is actually a projectile, telekinetic arrow. So the funny thing about this is that weapon art doesn't look like much, because it's, you know, it kind of just looks like the thing that the Frozen Needle does. The difference, though, is that the range on this is actually pretty good. So it's kind of weird because the spells of this class, the range is not that great, but the range of the weapon is actually better than a lot of the range of their spells, right? Not until you basically get Blood Comet. Blood Comet and this have almost the same range. So you can sort of sneak your way into getting range with this class with the Thorn of the Guilty. This is one thing I really like about it. Okay, the other weapon is the Crimson Briar Bow. So obviously all these weapons cause bleed buildup, but this one causes a lot of bleed buildup, and it's a Great Mace. It's a standard Great Mace moveset. But it has a really cool weapon art, which is called Briar Assault. It does this. It's just really fun. It's fun to bully enemies with this. Big bonk. Okay, and then we have the 3 armor sets. So the first one is the Pure Caster set, which is the Aberrant set. So this set adds Int, Arcane, reduces FP cost of sorcery, and increases the damage of aberrant sorceries across the board. And then the other set is the Briar set, which increases Int and Arcane, reduces weapon stamina cost by 2%, and increases weapon physical damage across the board. So one for melee, one for spells, and then the hybrid in between is the Bloodhound Knight set, which basically it gives you stats and then it boosts all physical damage rather than just spells or just weapons. So just the hybrid in between, and those are the 3 armor sets. In terms of like playstyle and encounters, it's a like class that I feel starts out a little bit weak, but not weak in terms of damage, weak in terms of utility. You don't have much to hit from far away, so it sort of asks you to rely on a weapon in the early part of your runs or early part of your playthroughs, but you certainly don't have to. You can still use spells, especially if you prioritize getting those spells early. But it's sort of a class that graduates to a certain point where your toolkit is so powerful once it's all culminated and put together that, especially if enemies bleed or bosses, if you come across bosses that bleed easily, then you will destroy everything with this class. But the class definitely struggles on things that don't bleed, right? So Radigan, Elden Beast, stuff like that, or even Skarta, if they don't bleed, it's a lot harder. It takes more time, takes more patience. But you do have decent defensive enchantments to help you along the way. It's definitely one of the more lopsided classes, and that was by design. We wanted this class to really shine against things that were bleeding and really struggle against things that were not. And so in that, if that being a goal, we were definitely successful. I think it's really fun. It's an interesting class. It's not like it's not typical. It's not the sort of thing you necessarily find in a lot of Souls games necessarily, like this style of play. And so because it has sort of a unique style, it's always going to be slightly more exciting to me. So anyway, hope you guys like this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe on the YouTube, and I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks.